Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I have been saving this conversation for some time, and I think now is that time. Dr. Tania Israel is a professor of counseling psychology who is also an expert on media polarization and how to limit its effect on us. I believe that we have an historic opportunity in the candidacy of Vice President Harris to turn the page on an era of politics that has been defined by division, resentment, and hate. But that is going to take real work, and it's going to take rejecting many of the tropes and stereotypes amplified by a media ecosystem that thrives off of fear. Dr. Israel has studied that ecosystem, and she also understands human psychology. I think you'll really appreciate her insights. Here is me and Dr. Tania Israel. My guest today is Dr. Tania Israel, a professor of counseling psychology at UC Santa Barbara. Her new book, Facing the Fracture, helps readers to reduce toxic input from media, manage polarizing thoughts and feelings, and engage effectively with others. Dr. Israel, welcome to Burn the Boats.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm so happy to be here.
You write in your book that the real danger to America, quote, isn't from extreme views on the left or the right, but from those who disengage from politics due to stress from the political divide. I'd love for us to unpack that today because as I see it right now, it seems like the real danger is from those on the right who are seeking to undermine democracy. How should I be thinking about that differently?
Well, I can certainly understand why you're seeing things that way, because there are a lot of things to be very concerned about. And one of the things we know from so much research is that most people are not at the extremes politically. So what we're seeing in the media and the people who post on social media about politics, we see an absolute overrepresentation of people at the extremes. And so we have a skewed perspective on the, proportion of the American public who's at the extremes. But actually most people are in the middle, what More Common calls the exhausted majority. And those people are so tired of the vitriol that they're hearing from both sides, and they're checking out of our democracy. And that's something I'm so concerned about.
So you make a distinction between the vast majority of Americans who are just trying to get on with their lives and with whom we actually have a lot in common, and the political leaders and the influencers, the provocateurs who are using anger, well, really to make money and gain or retain power.
Yeah, indeed. So most people, okay, now I've listened to your podcast, so I know, you are very knowledgeable about politics. You bring on guests who are very knowledgeable about politics. And I'm guessing that your listenership is very interested in politics. Most people aren't. Most people are, and I know that we'll say, well, politics affects every aspect of a person's life. So even if you're not interested in politics, it's affecting you. That's all absolutely true. And many people, they just have other priorities of where they're focused. They're raising kids. They're working multiple jobs. They're coaching Little League. They're doing other kinds of things where their main focus is not what's going on politically. And so the divide in our country is not just about left and right. There's actually a significant divide between people who are very interested in politics, the news junkies, the really emotionally activated people, and the rest of America who's just not so into it.
I think one of the points you make in the book is really going to resonate with this audience, which is the strategic ineffectiveness of maintaining that sense of anger and othering your political opposites. You write this in the book. Furthermore, our willful misunderstanding of others renders us ineffective strategists. Let's humanize rather than demonize those who disagree with us. Not only will this help you cultivate compassion, but understanding what might draw people to an opposing camp will also enable you to state your case from their frame of reference. I think that's a useful entree for the hyper politically engaged to maybe lower the barriers a bit, to try to understand what is driving someone to assault the Capitol on January 6th, because understanding that will make us more effective at countering it.
Yes, and even more so, I think understanding why somebody might not be so upset that people have done that. Because, again, most people did not storm the Capitol on January 6th. But a lot of people seem to not be as concerned about it as others. So I think that that's really who we need to understand. It's not necessarily the people at the most extreme. You know, people always say to me, oh my gosh, like bridging political divides, do I have to talk to white supremacists? And I'm like, no, you don't have to talk to white supremacists and neo-Nazis, but there's a lot of people who aren't that, who you're not understanding. And those are the people who I think we can reach.
Give me an example of an issue where that plays out. You talk about a few of them in the book, and you don't shy away from anything. You do vaccines, you do women's health care and abortion rights. I mean, these are all incredibly heated issues where, in fact, most Americans, if they don't agree 100%, they agree on probably 80% of the issues around these supposedly wedge political issues.
Yeah. I'll talk about issues and then remind me, I want to come back and to talk about tribal politics after that,
Sure.
because that's driving things sometimes more than issues. So in terms of issues, I started doing this work back in the 1990s when I founded a group to bring together pro-choice and pro-life people to have dialogue with each other. And it was an absolutely transformational experience for me. It didn't change anything about how I felt about abortion, but it changed so much about how I felt about people who disagreed with me on the issue. And some of that, you know, I was very pro-choice. I had worked in a clinic. You know, I had been on the front lines of a lot of things. And what I realized was that my way of viewing the other side through my experiences and my values made them seem irrational. Like, how can you possibly be a feminist for life? How can you be pro-life and, you know, support the death penalty? Like, I had so many really good logical inconsistencies that I could point out about the other side. But when I actually heard them talk about where they were coming from their own experiences and values, it made a lot more sense to me that their conclusions really came from where, you know, the way that they were viewing the world. And my conclusions similarly didn't make sense to them from how they were viewing things. So that's just, you know, one of the ways in which if we are judging other people based on our own frame, then, you know, the conclusions aren't coming from our frame. They're coming from theirs.
Your book is a useful prescription tool for bridging some of these divides and lowering the temperature and helping Americans understand each other better. But from a political standpoint, is there a way to operationalize understanding to win people over and win elections? Because
absolutely.
I'm looking at the next couple months and thinking, look, I do think I understand the other side. You know, grew up in a conservative religious family, childhood in Alabama, joined the military, but I want to win. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. So the operationalization of all of this is called deep canvassing. So, you know, deep canvassing, it's about, you know, you don't go and knock on somebody's door and tell them that they're wrong about everything. I mean, that's never what we've done with canvassing anyway, because that's just not a good use of our time. But it's going and engaging people in conversation where the goal of the conversation is to understand them, not to you know, lay out all of our views on them. And it turns out that people are responsive to knowing that somebody cares about their views, knowing that, that they value, and don't dismiss them. And so that's actually what makes people more interested in knowing, okay, well then, how should I vote? What are the views? And frankly, so I'm on the left. We don't do a good job of that all the time. We can be very dismissive. I'm going to say, something that I'm seeing going on right now, because people on the left say, oh, those people on the right, they're hostile and they're mean and, all of this, they're gonna take us down. And then, one of the things that I've seen is that in a week after, Kamala Harris became the Democratic, nominee for president, so much positive enthusiasm, and everybody in the left is going to say, oh, look how positive we are. And then there's, these memes and all of this stuff about like Vance having sex with a couch. And I cannot tell you how much I have seen that and how much I've seen people like talk about misinformation, like believing that that's actually true and spreading that further. And I'm like, oh, come on, people. This is not showing our best selves. This will drive people away because then people say, oh, they're mean. They're going to make fun of me. They're more interested in being clever than in being kind. And I think that that's a real concern, that we start to look like gleeful bullies, when we lean into that side of ourselves.
Set the couch memes aside. How would you prosecute the case against someone like J.D. Vance, who has argued for a federal response to women traveling for reproductive health care, who has said he couldn't care less what happens in Ukraine, who has now allied himself with someone he called America's Hitler? How do you prosecute that case without seeming mean?
Oh, I love that question because now I'm going to go back to tribal politics. It turns out that our job as Americans, there's people who it's their job to prosecute that case. If you're running for office, then sure. Most of us are not elected officials. And we're not pundits, even though we all seem to think we're supposed to be political strategists at this moment. But it turns out that we are friends, we are family members, we are community members and coworkers. And the way to reach other people in our circles is not by prosecuting a case. We think that what we're supposed to do is debate. But if you think about in a debate, you've got your side, you got the other side, and then you've got an audience. And you are never thinking that you're going to make such a good case that the other team is going to go, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right, and come over to your side of the podium and be on your team. No, you're trying to convince some kind of outside evaluator, a judge, the audience, voters. So, when we do that with other human beings, we don't win, because we think that we're supposed to be laying out all of our facts and figures and rationales, and that's somehow going to convince them. Even in a formal debate, that doesn't, and that's not what we're trying to do. So what we need to do is create human connection where we show that we care and that we're interested in knowing what somebody else has to say, that we're seeking to understand. We're not seeking to prosecute a case.
You write about the power of stories over facts and narrative over, I'm putting words in your mouth now, but narrative over Venn diagrams and pie charts, right? Stories connect with people in a way that data doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we think also that we're supposed to be, laying out the statistics, and that it turns out, so I'm a psychologist, so I can say we know this from research, that doesn't actually convince people. But if we can tell a story, that's much more helpful. Even if we're having conversations with people on our own side, I think this is helpful, because the conversations I hear so much these days is, somebody will state whatever they saw in the latest op-ed, and then the other person will go, yeah, right. And that's like the end of the conversation. It doesn't go very deep. It's not even, frankly, very interesting. What's more interesting is saying, well, this is how I got here. This is how I came from, where I grew up to the perspective that I have, or this is how this thing changed my view on things. And that's something people are much more interested in and gives us much more depth and nuance. I mean, one of the things that I learned about abortion is that most people's views on abortion can't fit on a bumper sticker. Like, we have more nuanced views. We have experiences with things that, if we talk about that instead of, talking about slogans, then we have a much better chance of reaching people.
Can you talk about the difference? I'm going to reference the book here between ideological polarization and effective polarization. This is a distinction I did not appreciate before.
So we talk about our country being really polarized. So ideological polarization is about the distance between our views. Like, how much does the left disagree with the right? And it turns out that there's been some increase in that over the years. But that, in my view, is not what is actually going to take down our democracy. What is actually eating away at our social cohesion is affective polarization. And that is the hostility, the animosity, the mistrust we feel toward people who disagree with us, people on the other side. And we can see how that is eating away at our relationships with other people. And frankly, that's what is the greatest problem for our democracy. In a democracy, we should have different views. We should be able to have different points of view. I mean, otherwise it's not a democracy. But we should also be able to value and respect people who hold another view and be able to talk about it.
Have you heard from conservatives, either after your TED Talk or from the galley copies of your book that have already gone out, about this approach to bridging the ideological divide? I'm asking because I'm wondering if there are fundamental temperamental differences between the left and the right in how they think about reaching across to the other side.
Mm-hmm. What I hear a lot, I will say, from the left is people saying, well, we want to do dialogue, but does the other side, that this is everybody's concern. I do these workshops and people are like, yes, but how many liberals and how many conservatives come? Because we think that the other side doesn't want to do this. Well, it turns out that, people from all sides of the spectrum are interested in this and willing to do this. But also people from all sides of the spectrum are really skeptical and are, in fact, opposed to what I'm doing here in terms of bridging divides. It goes against the strategy of both camps, because if we say, oh, these people are reasonable and we can have a conversation with them and we can seek to understand them because there's something valuable to understand, then that flies in the face of, look at those weird people over there. Why would we talk to them? They have no morals. They are uninformed.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have two favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support. Let's be honest, the aging process is not our friend when it comes to energy and productivity. That's where Qualia Senolytic comes in. Senolytics are a class of ingredients discovered less than 10 years ago, and they have enormous potential for promoting healthy aging. As we age, everyone accumulates senescent cells in their body. These cells cause symptoms of aging like aches and discomfort, slow workout recoveries, sluggish mental and physical energy associated with that middle-aged feeling. Also known as zombie cells, these cells are old and worn out and not serving a useful function for our health anymore, but they are taking up space and nutrients from our healthy cells. Take Qualia Senolytic just 2 days a month. The formula is non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, and the ingredients are meant to complement one another, factoring in the combined effect of all ingredients together. It has a 100-day money-back guarantee. New research on aging and longevity, including a clinical study on Qualia Senolytic, shows that senolytic supplementation can play a huge role in enhancing how we age. So give Qualia Senolytic a try. Go to qualialife.com/boats for up to 50% off and use code BOATS at checkout for an additional 15% off. For your convenience, Qualia Senolytic is also available at select GNC locations near you. That's QUALIA life.com/boats for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks to Qualia for sponsoring today's episode. Do you think the propensity, even tolerance of violence on the right is a differentiator? And I'm not talking about property damage and the things that the modern left often engages in as a form of protest, which itself I don't condone in any way. But we've entered a new era in which we actually have to fear for our physical safety when engaging with the other side. This isn't a uniquely American phenomenon, but it is exacerbated in America by the fact that there are 400 million guns, by the fact that the right increasingly thinks that political violence may be necessary to, quote, save the country. That has to affect the interpolitical, let me say that again. That has to affect the calculus around engaging with the other side when it comes to political differences.
You know, I hear people talk a lot about feeling unsafe. And so I always explore that. I'm like, oh, like, tell me about like feeling unsafe in a conversation with somebody. And they say, oh, well, I don't actually think that there's going to be physical violence, but I feel like they don't think I should exist, or I feel, some sense of threat from them. So I think that that's one of the things to differentiate is between feeling actually physically imperiled and feeling like you need to protect yourself from a threat in a more vague way. Because frankly, our fight, flight, or freeze response gets kicked up when we sense any kind of threat, even if that's a threat to our identities and our values and not a physical threat. There may be some differences there. Certainly, gun rights are more supported by one side than the other. However, like if you look at who's been buying guns a lot lately, like people on the left are feeling like, oh my gosh, we'd better be able to protect ourselves against those people on the right who have all those guns. And like people are just arming themselves up. And I think that this is something that we do need to be concerned about because people see the other side as the aggressor and feel like they are just trying to protect themselves. And both sides will say that. And frankly, the more... Okay, go ahead. I think I have to point out a clear distinction between those who, out of fear, feel the need to arm up to protect themselves and those who fetishize the AR-15, wear an AR-15 pin after a school shooting, pose with weapons in their Christmas cards. It is one side that is doing that and creating this air of violence and menace. And that has changed the tenor of our political conversations. And that is blame that cannot be evenly distributed. And that's fine. I mean, I don't think everything needs to be evenly distributed, but I guess I always go back to, okay, what's your goal? And my goal is always to say, all right, well, yes, we can prosecute that case. We can point out all those things. Or we can say to somebody who has who owns a gun, like, tell me about, like, why do you own a gun? Like, what's your experience with that? What's your history with that? What's your motivation? And we can have a human conversation about it. So laying out all these things and assuming that everybody owns a gun because because of that kind of culture of fetishizing weaponry, that's not where a lot of people are coming from with gun ownership. And like, you'll talk about, yeah, we agree about a lot of things. Americans agree that there should be some regulations on guns. And if we focus on that extreme of those who fetishize them, we're losing all those other people who could actually be allies and who we could work with on things.
Yeah. I guess I just don't think our politics reflect the reality of where most Americans are. And for the next couple of months, that's where I need to live. And the fact that we have a Congress that is defending bump stocks, a Supreme Court that has made them legal again, when the vast majority of Americans don't want that. I'm just trying to, bridge that gap, right, between what my neighbors say they want and what they're voting for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, most of us are not elected officials, but even the elected officials are trying to work together on some things. We don't see much coverage of that in the media. And so again, we can focus on all of those ways that we're embattled and that there's, where things have just ground to a halt in some ways, or that things are moving in directions that we're really concerned about. And I understand that. I am concerned about those things too. And at the same time, I say, all right, what's my goal? Where can I be most helpful? And I'll tell you the other thing. There's a whole movement that is focused on bridging divides and strengthening our democracy. And we hear so little about that in the media. So yes, there's certainly ways that we're at odds, but there's also ways where, the Governors Association is, doing this Disagree Better campaign, and that's led by Republican Utah governor. And so there's ways in which we're just not paying attention to all of the information here. And this is where we can talk about misinformation some too, but really I think one of the things we need to pay attention to is how what we're being exposed to is really skewed, and is really skewed in a way that's showing us all of the conflict, and that's really emotionally activating. And that frankly just isn't good for our health.
That's where I want to go. The disinformation, the rage scrolling that so many people do, that I catch myself doing sometimes, it's not only damaging to our politics, it's damaging to our health, certainly to my sleep on many nights when I see the latest thing that the former president said, or you name it, J.D. Vance. Can you talk about the damage that is doing to the fabric of society and to us as individuals?
Absolutely. So the way we consume media and the way we engage with social media, well, we're not doing it in very good ways. Like, we've got to figure out how to consume media in healthy ways before it consumes us, because, as it can be emotionally activated. And the doom scrolling, that's really, social media is kind of set up to do that. Like, it's going to keep feeding you things that you keep looking at. And so if you keep engaging with emotionally activating material, it's like, oh, okay, I'm just going to give you more and more of that. And then we just get drawn into it. So one thing about that is that level of emotional activation. Yes, people are losing sleep. This American Psychological Association does a Stress in America study every year. The level of stress related to political conflict just keeps going up. And so just in terms of our individual health, this is not good. So the things that are useful for us to do are to make intentional decisions about how we're consuming media. Turn off notifications. All those things that say they're urgent and breaking are actually not, for the most part. And so we don't need those. You can wait until the next day to learn about that thing. We don't have to have a hot take on everything at the moment that it happens. And so I think giving ourselves some space from the news is really good. Like, of course we want to stay informed, but rather than kind of have the baseline that the news is in our view all the time, make decisions about, okay, I'm going to have it off, but then I'm intentionally going to go in and learn about something, and then I'm going to turn it off again. So take a break. Rather than taking a break from it, take a break to go look at the news and then go back to living your life.
You write about Gen Z and its engagement with politics, in particular the campaign of Vice President Harris. Do you think there's an opportunity for that generation to break this cycle? They're digital natives. They're way more sophisticated than we give them credit for. And I see them as fundamentally optimistic. When I look at my own kids, when I look at the content their generation is producing, I don't know, there's something less dark about it than the stuff my generation seems drawn to. What's your take?
I think that, oh my gosh, Gen Z has been, I have seen so much Gen Z stuff lately because they're excited about things that are going on. I mean, I see everybody wanting some vision and some enthusiasm and not just the arguing back and forth. So something that we can all get behind, maybe do a TikTok dance about, like that's really great. But not only that, it's not only the sort of light, fun stuff, but I'm really seeing some organizing. Swifties for Harris is putting out information about, like, how do you make sure you're registered to vote? And this is something that's so essential because there has been an increase in youth voting over the last election cycles, but youth are the age group that's least likely to vote. And a lot of that has to do with logistics. When you ask young people why they don't vote, we think, oh, they feel disenfranchised, they're not excited about a candidate. They actually say, I don't have time. And when I think about like what life is like when you're in your 20s, then you are maybe going to school, you're maybe working multiple jobs, you're maybe raising kids, you're maybe moving every year. And so your life is just more chaotic. If you've got to re-register every time you move, if you've got to figure out how to vote in a new place that you're living, all of those things make voting more time consuming and more difficult. So I'm really excited about the enthusiasm that I see in Gen Z. And we've all got to make sure that we're supporting young people in terms of just that path to being able to vote on a very logistical level.
I am sure there are young members of this audience who would not forgive me if I didn't also point out that one side of our political system is trying to make it harder for young people to vote by, for example, in certain states saying that a college ID isn't acceptable, but a driver's license is. Or in Kenyon College in my home state a few years ago, the lines to vote because of the lack of polling places were hours and hours and hours long. That is systematic. I don't know that there's a question here, but I think one of the reasons young people are frustrated is that they are they're marginalized when it comes to the franchise.
Yeah. So there's not a question, but I do have an answer. So the left and the right have narratives about what's going wrong with our elections. And the right is saying that it's about voter fraud, and the left is saying it's about voter suppression. So it turns out there's voter fraud, absolutely insignificant. Voter suppression, like there are things that are going on that's making it harder to vote. Even more so than either one of those, the problem is voter disengagement. It's the people who aren't even trying to vote. And that's who I want to engage. So I think that those are the people who, if we can get them engaged, that strengthens our democracy considerably. So that's where trying to lower the vitriol is going to maybe draw them in more, where trying to just understand where they're coming from and have that kind of conversation rather than going in with, with all of our arguments, that's going to do a better job at reaching them. They're the ones who say, oh, both sides are the same. And I know when I hear that, I think, how can anyone think that the Republicans and Democrats are the same? They're so clearly different. But when you listen to the tone that's coming from Republicans and Democrats, they don't sound that different from each other, the demonizing of the other side and all of that. So I think where we can be more human, that's where we can reach those people, and that will address a huge voting issue.
What are your biggest fears? And we'll end, don't worry, with your biggest hopes, but what are your biggest fears over the next couple of months going into the most significant presidential election of our lifetimes?
Sure. I know this is such a challenging time. So one of my fears is because I know that the more that people believe that the other side will do things to circumvent our democracy, then the more, we feel like, oh, well, then we'd better do that too. And the same thing with violence. If we think that the other side is going to be more violent than we think, well, then I guess, it's okay if our side is more violent. It's those misperceptions of the other side, because actually these are real misperceptions that we have, that are between what we see in the media and our own cognitive biases. Like, we have really skewed perceptions of how divided we are, of who the people on the other side are, and not only how extreme what they believe is, but how likely it is that they're actually going to do something to undermine democracy. We, for the most part, all believe in democracy, but the more we misunderstand that, the more likely we are to do something that's going to undermine our democratic system. And that's the thing I'm most concerned about. I'm most concerned about the way that our misperceptions of political division and of the other side are going to, really diminish our support for democratic processes and principles.
Okay, let's try to end on a more uplifting note. What's your biggest area of optimism and hope going into the November election?
I'm so glad you asked. People keep framing me as the hopeful closer, so I'm going to be the hopeful closer here. Everything that we can do, and that I recommend in my book, that will help us to navigate these times of political division, how we consume news, correcting our misperceptions, developing resilience, intellectual humility and perspective taking, engaging in our communities. All of these things are not only going to help us as individuals to be healthier people, but they're all going to help us to be better partners, better coworkers, better community members. They're going to strengthen the fabric of our country and of our democracy, whether we're in politically challenging times or not. So this is an opportunity for us to recognize where we don't necessarily have all of our skills in place. And this is a moment for us to step up and really try to develop some of those qualities that are going to help us to be more resilient, more engaged, and more mentally healthy people in the end. I mentioned the bridging movement before. That is the thing that makes me most hopeful. There are over 500 organizations that are working on bridging divides and strengthening our democracy. And knowing about those is so hopeful and helpful. I'm going to say the one action that I'm going to suggest people take. I know I should be telling everyone to go buy my book. You should do that too. But go to the Listen First Project website and take the Listen First pledge, which just means you'll get signed up for the weekly emails on Listen First Friday. Knowing what people are doing in this country to make it a better country, a better democracy, and to strengthen our social cohesion, that is so encouraging, and I just love it. So I want to make sure more people know about it because the media is not covering it so much.
Well, I certainly hope your optimistic vision wins the day. The book is Facing the Fracture. Dr. Israel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.